Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should go forward along our program. Actually, we have the next session, which is devoted to climate change again, and which has the question in the headline: is the COVID-19 pandemic a chance to combat climate change? We have already started this discussion a little bit, but we are looking forward to continue it. Actually, the moderator of this session would be Manfred Hafner, the professor of Sciences Po, but he just wrote that he will be a little bit late, unfortunately, because he just finished his classes right now, and I think he will be in a couple of minutes. But I think not to lose time, we may start with our first presentation, which will be held by jointly by Brian O'Callaghan, lead researcher and project manager of the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project, and Franziska Funke, who is a research assistant in the Institute for New Economic Thinking at University of Oxford. So the floor is yours, guys, and I think that Manfred will join us in a couple of minutes, and I will pass the privilege and responsibilities of moderator to him as far as he will join us. Please.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for having us today. I'm starting to share my slides, and then Brian will start with the first part of the presentation.
Wonderful. Hi there, everyone. An absolute privilege to be joining you today. Both Franziska and I are based here at the Smith School and Institute for New Economic Thinking at the University of Oxford, and we plan to provide perspectives relating to two papers which we've been involved with over the last few months. I should speak briefly about the role of the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project. Over the last 10 months or so, we have been working quite tirelessly with stakeholders around the world to advise on how to incorporate long-term objectives to short-term stimulus spending. And for us, in many ways, the highest priority in that conversation has been in stimulating green spending, and so thinking about what the economic characteristics of green spending are. Would you mind going to the next slide, Franziska? So let's first start at the beginning. In framing the COVID climate discussion, we think it's helpful to think about interactions in four key areas. Three here are time dependent, and one is overarching. Firstly, we'll see on the left-hand side of the screen here, we've seen short-term effects as a result of COVID in the form of emissions reductions spurred by a slowing economy, and I'll get to this in a second. Secondly, over the next months and years, and in part this has already started, governments have the potential to use short-term fiscal spending to dramatically shape the future trajectory of emissions. And in this sense, we talk about decoupling growth from emissions. In the longer term, we see changes to social and institutional norms over COVID that have already sort of accelerated trends that were underway prior to the crisis itself. The easiest example here is just working from home and therefore less transportation needs. And we see that some of those long-term changes could bring structural shifts to emissions profiles. Of course, the magnitude of those shifts is the biggest unknown. Underpinning all of these, and this is what Franziska will spend a lot of her time speaking to, we find a series of broader learnings which we could take from the COVID response to guide future climate policy and engagement with politicians and also ordinary citizens too. If we can move on. So let's start with the short-term impact of mobility restrictions and general consumer uncertainty, which continues in most countries today, but importantly, not in all countries. In combination, these mobility restrictions, etc., have precipitated what we describe as simultaneous demand-side and supply-side economic shocks in the first quarter of 2020. Obviously, we've moved on from there, but that was the starting point. A number of studies have been put forth over the last few months talking about estimates for direct emission impacts of the virus itself. Initially, they range from almost a negative 15% range to around about 0. In more recent months, there may actually be more recent studies than what are on the screen here, but we have seen the estimated reduction in emissions estimates shrinking. And I believe that current expectations are in the range of -4% to -7% year on year versus 2019, of course. And I think a particularly important note here is China. I missed most of the last session, but I did hear some discussion about China and the Chinese action in terms of climate action. When it comes to COVID recovery, the reporting that we're seeing is that Chinese consumption and manufacturing are in some cases above last year's levels at a similar time in the year. And so the China effect has been to reduce the magnitude of emissions fall. So one of the ultimate implications of this figure, I think, is that solving global warming through lifestyle changes alone is not really possible. In order to meet the 1.5 degree by 2050 targets, I think we would have to reduce emissions by about 7% every year, right? Can you imagine the lifestyle changes that we've seen in 2020 repeated every year to 2050? No, of course not. So the moral here is that we're going to need some significant technological change. If we can move on, Franziska. So one mechanism for doing exactly that is to use, in some ways, unprecedented government fiscal spending to target positive climate impacts. Prior to this crisis, in many policy circles, you would be familiar, there's been a dangerous climate misnomer. There's a preconception, or there was a preconception, that climate positive spending necessarily comes at the cost of economic growth. And so I partnered with Cameron Hepburn, Joseph Stiglitz, Nicholas Stern, and Dimitri Zengelis, names who I'm sure you're familiar with, early in April, to demonstrate that this is simply not true. In our study, we set out to prove that climate positive government spending could not only support short-term economic recovery, but in some ways it can do so better than neutral or dirty spending. So to demonstrate this in the paper, we took a three-pronged approach, and I'll post a link to the paper in the chat afterwards. We reviewed the green attributes of past stimulus policies and created a database looking and reviewing past stimulus policies. We analyzed past studies on the attributes of policy, and the biggest part of the study in the middle is a survey of over 230 leading economists representing central banks, finance ministries, really the very top of those organizations. And we asked them a question presented on the next slide. We asked them to rate a series of policy archetypes at the bottom in accordance with long-run economic multiplier, the speed of implementation, and potential climate impact. And this image, this plot, is the result of that study. And it's a plot that's been reprinted everywhere from the Times to the New York Times. I know that for a while, Prince Charles was handing it out to his compatriots here in the UK. So on the graph, each of the bubbles represents a policy. The green square, or the green rectangle, is what we call our Goldilocks zone or our Greenilock zone. It's the policies that both bring high economic impact and high climate impact. And so we're talking about here, connectivity infrastructure investment, which might be public transport. We're talking about clean energy infrastructure. We're talking about clean R&D and green worker retraining for green jobs. Another interesting point is little policy E in the bottom left-hand side. Those were unconditional airline bailouts, who the respondents of this survey thought were very bad in terms of economic impact and climate impact. So that was the starting point for us, and we teased out a number of policy implications from that study, which are here on the screen. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through each in particular, but we identified some policies. We, based on the literature, suppose that there are also additional opportunities for providing co-benefits from investing in these policies. Co-benefits could be social health type benefits. They might be environmental in terms of air pollution. They could be social in terms of inequality as well, perhaps targeting your energy efficiency retrofits to low-income households. And the third major policy finding was that really when it comes to green policy and green fiscal spending, the devil is in the detail. But as I say, this was just the starting point for us, the study, and the last 8 months or so. On the next slide, Franziska, we should be on the slide with the graph again. Yes, exactly. As we have sort of built on the process, we've been, as I say, advising governments all around the world, in some cases to great effect, but we've also been tracking their spending, and we've been trying to bring transparency to government spending. We have a database of 2,500 policies from the largest 50 economies in the world, including the temporal components, to really identify who is spending and what they're spending on and what the characteristics of that spending are in terms of economic and green. This particular slide here gives an overall perspective. I think these are, I've limited this one to G20 nations. You can see that most countries have spent heavily on rescue type spending, recovery type spending. We've only really seen significant forms of that from the UK and Australia. In Australia, that makes a lot of sense. They're further along in terms of dealing with the virus. The UK is a little bit more of an anomaly, and we can discuss that afterwards. But we're out of time, so Franziska, the next slide. Just to give an idea of the green components of this spending, we estimate that we've seen about 600 billion in climate positive spending to date, mostly from France, Germany, Korea, and the UK. On the screen, you see this as proportional to GDP, with France leading. And Franziska, the next slide, sorry. Those figures looked reasonably large on a single screen when you're just talking about green, but when you compare the green spending to non-green spending, it's a completely different picture. So here we're looking purely at the recovery type expenditure. Sorry, recovery type spending, we haven't quite got to expenditure yet. But when you're looking as proportional to the rest of spending, it's not an encouraging picture. There's obviously a lot more recovery spending to come from other nations, and therefore a significant opportunity, but so far the world really isn't doing too great. I think at this point I'm going to hand over to Franziska to talk more broadly about some policy findings, but if you are interested in this database and just generally the work that is going on here, please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, thank you, Brian. I am now going to talk a little more about the cross-cutting lessons that we can draw from COVID-19 for the future of climate change mitigation. And this is based on joint work with our colleagues David Leonid at the European Commission and Linus Matter, who's also at the University of Oxford Institute for New Economic Thinking. So we tried to compare both crises and try to discern from the actions of what policymakers were doing, what we can really take away for better climate change mitigation in the future. So just to start with how we can compare these two issues, certainly COVID-19 and climate change can be characterized as global public bets with nonlinear growth dynamics, which Gernot Wagner has previously also illustrated a bit. We think that there are two important distinctions between COVID-19 and climate change. One is that for infectious disease, there's some form of exclusion possible, which means that locally you can actually mitigate the virus and also gain local benefits from it, which means that you have much bigger incentives for localized mitigation as well than you would have for climate change. And the second would be that climate change evolves over much longer timescales, which in turn means that your policy action has to be much more anticipatory. So you have to act well in advance before you see the worst damages of climate change, which might again complicate things. The second similarity between the two crises, and to our mind, is that there's societal consensus required if you want to make progress on them. For once, both issues, tackling both issues inevitably creates losers, be it the businesses that are especially harmed by long lockdowns, such as in gastronomy, other service industries, or for climate change, the industries that would really need to shift their business models away from fossil fuels. You need to get those polluters and those especially hard-hit sectors on board if you want to make progress. And then second, more broadly, policy action is also to some degree constrained by public opinion and polarization, and you have to get citizens on board if policymakers really want to enact policies that change a lot. So the lessons that we discern, we draw here 5 lessons for climate policy, are not at all new. We just think that COVID-19 gives them renewed importance. So I will, for the sake of brevity, now just zoom in on 2 of them, but give you a quick summary of all of them later. So the first lesson that we really discern is that delay is costly. For COVID-19, there have been a couple of studies that estimated the costs of delay that happened to different states. And here I'm highlighting a study from the United States by Pei et al., which showed for the period between mid-March and early May that starting social distancing just 1 week earlier could have avoided 55% of deaths, which here equals to 36,000 lives in this time span. But even though you can directly see that due to these exponential dynamics, it's just the rational thing to do to act early, we only saw that only very few countries, and those were the ones with recent experience in epidemics, actually flattened the curve sufficiently. Here on the right-hand side, you can see that South Korea, China, Taiwan were much more successful in not letting the cumulative cases adjusted to population escalate, such as you see in the US, Spain, and the UK. Now we see similar dynamics for climate change where IAM-based studies such as that by Fuhrmann et al. From 2015 showed that delaying climate action by, let's say, 10 years increases the cost of later climate action by 37%. So here as well you have these high costs of delay. And since we have, again, the longer time spans over which climate change evolves, this especially impacts innovation and adoption of new technologies and may thus create carbon lock-in or, by hampering innovation, even limit our mitigation options in the future. So based on the vast wisdom of literature in climate policy and political economy, we derive 2 policy recommendations to master this challenge. One would be to create institutions that have long-term policy goals in mind. In the literature, some people have talked about carbon central banks, for example, just taking the power out of these policy cycles. And the second, very similar, just strengthening incentives for long-termism by delegating powers. You can see that, for example, in the UK, which has created an expert committee on climate change, which devises policies with a more long-term vision and also kind of forces policymakers who are more preoccupied with the midterm to confront this issue. So then I want to highlight a second lesson of the ones that we draw here, and this might in part help us explain why we actually delay action by so much, and it's that public perception matters. We assume here that policy action is at least partially constrained by public opinion, and that public supports depend on how imminent citizens perceive a threat to be. Now, COVID-19 has really captured the imagination of people in the course of the epidemic and the pandemic, but COVID-19, but climate change has not, and this is why we see that citizens tolerated strict limitations on their liberties for COVID-19, the lockdowns, really strong limits on their liberty of movement, but at the same time they opposed rather minor interventions to counter climate change. And in order to formalize this a little, the relationship between the perception of damages in the population and the willingness to respond, we've come here up with a more conceptual graphic here. It would be nice to have to maybe do more research about this in the future and to substantiate this with data and see how this curve behaves if you put data to it. But we think that really the perception of damages for COVID-19 has changed dramatically between January and April, for example, and you can see then willingness to respond moving along on this curve, while for climate change, the perceived damages are much, much lower. So what can you do against this? We highlight two things. For once, you could try to increase psychological awareness and move the perceived damages for climate change higher along this curve to maybe mirror the actual damages that we have to fear. In order to do that, you can, for example, also look to communication advice from attribution science, where climate scientists really try to illustrate the relationship between increases in greenhouse gas emissions and extreme weather events that people are experiencing as they evolve. Another option for really changing perceptions is to make climate policy appealing for other features than the emissions reductions, moving a bit away from this graph here and highlighting things such as their potential for economic growth, for job creation, or for co-benefits in order to get more people on board. Okay, just as a quick summary, I now zoomed in on two of these lessons. We also talk a bit about that inequalities are exacerbated by both of these crises, which really entails a need to address distributive concerns when we think about recovery packages and climate policy. Collaboration is crucial for tackling both crises, and we've especially seen that those COVID-19 policies that were bipartisan and that tied in a lot of people on both ends of the political spectrum were very successful. And we think that that's something that needs to be done in climate change as well. And finally, we heard it earlier, nobody has listened to so many epidemiologists in their lifetime before as during this year, and scientific policy advice was really everywhere, but we also had to see that it's never value-free and that there was a really honest and big debate about how proportional measures were and how they have to be, and that's something that policymakers can't get out of the way. And it's also important to communicate better and inoculate citizens against the misinformation that's happening in such an environment. To summarize very quickly, some have commented on this and said climate change is the much, much bigger wave and crisis that is yet to come. And from the comparisons that we drew, we can sort of say, yes, it is for these characteristics, that it's much more long-term and there are less incentives for localized mitigation. But if we draw the right lessons, we can maybe make the challenge, we can rise to the challenge. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Brian and Franziska. So we have time for questions. Please feel free to write them down in chat, or just raise your hands, or just signalize me that you want to ask a question. You are very welcome. Unfortunately, Manfred Hafner would not join us because he just sent me a message that he needs to rush to the hospital for an emergency with his baby, so he won't join us. But again, I will continue moderating. And I will be happy to read your questions from the chat, or to give you the floor if you want to ask something. Actually, I will start myself. Actually, your set of recommendations starts with building the institutions that are oriented to long terms. It is a very good recommendation, but then give us, please, recommendation how to do it.
That's a very good point. Yes, and in that sense, it's a bit idealistic and first best the recommendations that we draw there. I do think we have some real-world examples where these things are working, such as the expert committee on climate change in the UK that I mentioned. But you're right that the political will was there, and there was also the public support to support institutions like this and to make this work. And where these factors are not given, it's certainly a much longer way to arrive there.
I think another component is transparency. And what we've been trying to do with this observatory and tracking international spending is bring transparency to the discussion. I think for many real people who are electing the politicians that create the institutions, they don't understand to the full extent the size of the missed opportunity in a lot of instances, right? I think that politicians are naturally incentivized to bring outcomes that are beneficial in the short term, and in that way forget about the long term. So if you can perhaps bring a bit more transparency to the way in which politicians are missing out on these opportunities, I think it could possibly play a role in at least getting the conversation started.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. We have a question from Gernot. Brian and Franziska, very well done. One question: have you looked at political polarization and COVID or climate response?
This is definitely something that we are interested in. And Franziska, maybe you have done some additional work that I'm not as familiar with, but it's a fantastic question, and thank you for it. All I can really say is that in many of our advisory conversations, we've been facing this head on, right? And in those cases, at least on the economic recovery side, it's actually just come down to framing. So, for example, we've had very high-level conversations with leaders in Australia, which the current political leaders there are more towards the right. And for every one of those conversations, I have the same recommendations, but I change the framing. I never say the word green, I never say the word climate, I say prosperity. I talk to them about a prosperity stimulus that can bring jobs to rural locations, a prosperity stimulus that can help enhance economic growth for the long term. And those types of narratives, I mean, they make a lot of sense, and so they seem to catch on a little bit more. But unfortunately, we haven't looked into it systematically. We'd love to do it though. Francesca, I know you're also interested in the space. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I can add a little bit on that, though, not so much on COVID, but more on the more general question of how you can garner public support around climate policies, which is something that Linus Makarov at the University of Oxford is, for example, also looking into. And there has been a recent paper really looking at what measures are supported by what groups in society, and really the main policy recommendations that you can draw from that is to make sure that when you design policies, try to make them appealing to the people who are maybe not yet on board, because very often policymakers then tend to create that policy that seems to appeal to most people, like recycling revenues from carbon pricing through green spending, but which is a little bit like preaching to the choir, where we want to get those people on the other side of the political spectrum that are polarized in a different direction on board, and really seeing how you can design policies differently to appeal to them, maybe address more the distributive concerns there. That could go a long way.
That's very important. Unfortunately, I have to go to an IMF briefing now, but I will be back in an hour or so if there are further questions later on, or maybe just to participate in discussion. Thank you all. Francesca is very capable in handling everything from here.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and we are looking forward to see you again. And I think that we will have the discussion actually at the end of the session. So you are welcome to rejoin us.
Fantastic.
And now, if there are no questions, no immediate questions, so I will pass the floor to Professor ZhongXiang, the founding dean and distinguished university professor at Tianjin University, and we hope to listen to Chinese perspective on the green recovery, on the issues of coping with climate change. Please, the floor is yours.
Let me first share the can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We hear you well. We see the presentation as well.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and for the invitation. And this is a very hard time for me, and actually the first time for me to give a talk, and even in 10 o'clock. It is 10 o'clock in the Beijing time. And anyhow, and today I'd like to share some of my thoughts on the China commitment to climate mitigation. And this is a long story from the late 90s, when China talked about the possibility to commit into carbon intensity, basically means the carbon emission per unit of GDP. To recently, President Xi mentioned that China would commit to carbon neutrality by 2060s. I would say, because I follow this climate negotiation from late 90s, and I would say there are a couple of time points which are very crucial. One is around the time when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and that time was industrialized country and the so-called Annex I country committed to a specific target, and then put pressure on China to do something, at least trying to be comparable. And that time, that is one point. Another timeline is around the Copenhagen Climate Summit. That is a time where that the pressure on the developing country to take on the absolute emission target, particularly for the major economics like China, India, Mexico, and like this kind of countries, in additional countries which are already committed. And because the Copenhagen failed to the mandate, then move on to the Paris, and this is still going on. And after the successful Paris Agreement, and then we talk about the post 2020s, and in this context, the China President mentioned that the carbon neutrality. So let me on this background, let me see what's going on over the years, and to see how the progress made and what we could expect in the future. Particularly this time, the timing is very crucial, because China started to next 5-year plan starting next year, and the government are working on the plan which might be incorporated some climate commitment. And so that reason, this carbon neutrality is also very crucial, both for to cap the temperature below the 2 degrees, also for China real actions. And my presentation basically based on the couple of articles which I written over years, and if you're interested, I'd be very happy to share with you. And so anyhow, I already sent my slide to the organizers, and that is also a place where you can obtain all the information. Let me start the first commitment regarding the carbon intensities. And as I said, a Kyoto Protocol where the Annex I country has already committed to the target. At that time, the country, in particular US, put pressure on the China and to see whether China can do something. At that time, I was working the University Groningen in Holland, Faculty of Economics, Faculty of Law. I was committed by commissioned by the UNDP and to write down what would act from China. I mentioned several options, and including one is around 2020, China could take on commitment like carbon intensity, carbon emission per unit of GDPs. So that is what I suggested to 1998, and also later on published in the journal World Development. At that time, I saw that the bottom line for the China would be that with the national level is the carbon intensities, and could be also capped some sectoral emissions. And if you look at what's going on recent years, we do see that the government already committed to the carbon intensities, and also cap the some sector productions like coal, like some materials. So this is basically we suggested in the 1998, and 10 years later, in the year 2009, then our Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, on behalf of Chinese government, speaking the Copenhagen climate, and now officially mentioned that China committed carbon intensity target, that is, will reduce carbon intensity by 40 to 45 in the year 2020 by relative to 2005 levels. And I would say this is still a big move by government, because before China government was a very strong position against any kind of space commitment. So from that angle, that is a very big jump. On the other hand, there are also some discussion whether there is any room for China to improve the commitment. And that time, I also did one study and to look at and what kind of room can reach. And we did this. This is only one. This year is only one study, but actually this was a long studies to finally inform that China could reach that target from 40 to 45 to 46 to 50% carbon intensity reduction over the period which government sketched. And why this 46 to 50% cut is crucial. This is more related to IPCC report. You know, it's in the IPCC report, usually it's always have some kind of commitment recommended for developed country. For example, like in that report, I mentioned developed country have to be cut the emission level by 80% in the middle of centuries. But actually, there are also some kind of call, although maybe it's not as stringent as a commitment for developed country, but still there are some call for the action from developing country side. So that is suggest that for developing country, you should reduce your carbon emission from your baseline level by 50 to 30%. So that is from IPCC report. So if China can reach this kind of commitment to 46 to 50%, so that means China will reduce their absolute emission level from baseline by 50 to 21%. So this is crucial because it's, in the international stage, and that time you always see that China ask developed countries to do this, do that. But if you also do what the IPCC calls for developing countries, that might give you much more strong legitimate moral or legitimate reason for you to ask developed countries to do. And this is 46 to 50% target. That was I did for 11 years ago. But look at what exactly happened in China nowadays. By end of last year, Chinese officially statistic numbers show that the carbon intensity reduction reduced by 49%. So then so given this year's, might be overall number will be slightly more than 50%. That reason I say that our study sketched 11 years ago is very, very, at least is in line with what happened nowadays. And then, so that is all related to the 2020 target. And then in the Copenhagen meeting, and at that time there's really pressure on a few major developing economics and trying to take on a hard commitment. At that time, I was also asked by IPCC working group chair, Professor Callaghan, to write a report to say what would can expect from China until the 2050s. So that time so this is a report for them, but later on the paper was published in this International Environment Agreement. Basically, in that report, I made, of course, there are many analyses, but the conclusion statement is basically two. One is, at the right time, China should signal well ahead that they should take on the binding emission cap around the 2030s. So this is that was I called in the 2009, and then in the year 2014, November, and Chinese President Xi and U.S. President Obama finally agreed on, and they have made the announcement of join the U.S.-China climate joint declaration, and China officially committed at that time that we will cap emission around 2030. But of course, recently the President Xi said we will try to achieve the emission peak before 2030. But back to 2014, they said it was around 30. But initially we suggested in 2009 that suppose China should take on. Another proposal we made that time because we talk about the long-term target and what China could be. And basically I would say is any target which is come out, probably relatively easier for EU and for Japan because they are two large economies which have very high energy efficiency and also citizens in these two countries which basically are more climate and environmental friendly. And so then I thought that maybe there's something which can bring US China together, and the target are both hard for both of them. So that was I suggest. And the first suggest that the emission level should be 80% by developed country. And this is from IPCC. And my suggestion is for per capita emission levels for all major countries by 2050 should be no more than world average. So this is an easy target for EU, for Japan, but it will be very, very hard for United States, for China. For US is because the country already service dominates economics, and basically emission is from service and for the private citizens, and given the per person 20-ton carbons, and given this kind of economic structures, given the people is already enjoy driving big cars, living big house, would be very, very difficult. And for China at that time, per capita emission already close to EU levels, but it's still in the process of industrialization, and the emission level could be still climbing on to 10 tons. And so if you want to reach to the world average levels, that's still very, 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 very difficult. So now, even given the President Xi target that neutralities, I would say that unless that the US also achieve the neutrality by 2050, otherwise, then the two countries probably still more than world average. So that is, I guess, is a much harder target. And let me say that by the 2040, and the Chinese government officially committed that China would cap emission level around the 2030s. So then immediate questions and what level that the peak would be. And basically we see all the modeling calculation, and the baseline would be 120 gigatons. And if you want to keep below the 100 gigatons, would be very unlikely. And mostly preferred target would be trying to keep with 105 gigatons. And another thing is depend on how renewable would be in the total energy mix. And that is also determine how high the peak and how early and a peak would be. And so model calculation basically states that if you want to peak before 2030, then renewable and no fossil fuel should be more than 25%, and the official aim is 20%. But another couple of big questions also be whether this kind of commitment is very ambitious and whether it's achievable, and what cost. And there are many ways to look at. And one way to look at is relative baseline. So if your baseline says that you will peak in the year 2050, and now you move earlier to 2030, certainly is ambitious. But there's other way to look at it. That means if you globally want to achieve a 2-degree target, what China should do. And that is also the general way to look at. And here I show a number of the model results, which is, these are the very famous global models, and which from energy modeling firm from Stanford, Leonid from the FAME in the Venice, and SSP, which is probably the German group. And basically we will see, based on all this modeling exercise, which are published in the article in the PNAS, and basically states that if you want to achieve the 2-degree target globally, China emission should be peak before 2025, and once the peak, emission level should be immediately go down. And recently, when the China President Xi mentioned that they will peak, we will carbon neutral by 2060s, and I guess it's maybe a couple of weeks ago, the government started a long-term plan for next 5 years and until the 2035. There is one sentence mentioned around the 2045, what the emission level would look like in China. Government used the words that we should keep emission and the peak level, and then is slightly go down. But if you see that if you want to achieve this carbon neutrality, if China achieve the carbon neutrality, basically they will have a 2-degree because based on IPCC, if you want to achieve the 2-degree target, basically ask for all the countries have achieved the carbon neutrality by 2060 to 2070s. And if the biggest emitter, China now is already 30% of global emission. If China can achieve the carbon neutrality by 2060, then most likely that we will achieve the 2 degrees. And that reason, the government, this is very unexpected. China made that announcement. But once you made the announcement, and your emission profile should not be just keep that high profile, that's slightly reduced. It should be reduced very quickly, otherwise, and this commitment would not be achieved. And this is a study by a number of Chinese institution, because sometimes China always say, oh, you don't trust the study by outside and we should do ourselves. But anyhow, you see that the left figures by Chinese study still, in line with what IPCC, also other global working group. And the bottom line, the lowest line, that is the one trying to achieve the 1.5 degree, and the second from bottom, that was a 2 degree target, and that is the top line. That is one based on China commitment in the Paris Agreement. You will see that even based on the Paris Agreement, if you want to achieve the Paris Agreement, and you will see that by the middle of this century, China emission level would be still more or less similar as current levels. Yeah, so that is now, if you want to achieve the 2 degrees, basically is more or less like indicating that the line would be the top line. With this very, right panel will be go to this red line. Red line, you will see from this red line, you will very significantly departure what the government not is committed. So this is a very, very big commit. And if you look at the energy mix and what this line would state, that if you want to achieve the carbon neutrality, basically means coal in the total energy mix in China would be reduced below the 10%. Currently is something around 57% in the energy mix. But if you want to achieve the neutrality, and that means by 2050 coal would be only around 10%, and also basically means carbon emission, net carbon emission would be 0, and then you have some non-carbon emission there, and end up with some the sinks and the CCS, and then trying to make this become neutral. So this is a very, very big commitment, and there are hardly any studies to do economic analysis to see what the cost would be to achieve this. But the good thing is the timing. They make this kind of announcement. The timing good, because this government just wants to set up the 14 5-year plan. This is when will be set a new target for carbon emissions and so on. So I might basically stress that if you really take this target seriously, government, that I would say from most of rich cities in China could be have a carbon peak around the 2020s. So then give some less developed country, a less developed region, and have more time to go and to let the emissions still goes. Yeah? Anyhow, this is basically my what I like to share with you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So you shown us the evolution of goals of Chinese climate policy, and it is actually very impressive, because it started with very modest goals, but now it's sets, the declaration of Xi Jinping about carbon neutrality is a very, very ambitious goal is set. And it is really very interesting that China passed this way from very, very modest goals to very, very ambitious goals, probably the most ambitious in the world. Okay, so now we have time for questions. I think about 5 minutes for questions. Please, dear colleagues, participants, don't be shy and ask your questions. Actually, let me start. One of the important questions about the long-term climate policies and about long-term targets is from what we should start. In Russia, the dominant point of view is that we should start with some assumptions about technologies. And based on these assumptions on technologies, and then calculating the costs of the implementation and the benefits of the implementation, we should set the strategy of long-term policy to reduce emissions. But the way that China choose is absolutely opposite. So it starts with the goal. So you set the goal for on carbon neutrality for 2060, and then now the objective is to understand how this goal may be achieved, with what technologies, with what costs, and so on. So these are absolutely different approaches to the long-term planning and to long-term strategies in the climate policy. What is your opinion? Why the Chinese approach is really more beneficial, if it is, of course, than, say, Russian approach? Because here in Russia, many people really do not believe that such goals which start with the such strategies will start with the goal, but not with the assumptions and not with the like economic trends, they may be achieved.
I guess is what I told you is about what the government decisions, and particularly from the President Xi announcement. But I would say the academic communities, given this are the very big commitment, I wouldn't see even a person like myself, have been working on since the 1990s. I published my first article in this area, 1990 English. So even for myself, I didn't really see any kind of serious, broad discussion about these issues. The government already made an announcement about this kind of commitment. This is very, very rare by any standard, and even it is. But on the other hand, I would say this is what his announcement is not from the heaven. This is also already have some group of modular group of researchers do this kind of thing and to see what China commitment would be. Probably that kind of commitment could be, maybe China should get carbon neutral by 2070s, maybe, instead of 2060s. So I guess there are some of these kind of things. But I would say that once certainly there are some ways. One way, like what you said, Russia, and you have assumption, you see the technologies, and given the technology, and given the cost, given the maturities, given the implementation stage and the speed and scale, that you can see and what kind of commitment would be. And this is the one way. Another way is, and sometimes not only China, but even like we do the economic analysis, and we want to achieve some goals, and we also look back and to see, this is some goal which we want to do, that we can see and that level what energy technology should be, and how many percent should be coal, how many percent nuclear, some renewables. So this is the way. Also look at, I would say that for the government analysis, particularly like this kind of commitment, I always say that is a combination both approach, because it's a country like China and maybe Russia, India, sometimes is also have the international pressure to do more and earlier than what would be and the business scenario, because the EU and the other countries already made a commitment that they put the pressure on you. So that reason sometimes you need to look at based on what your standard approach and what you can achieve, and then you look at what the EU asked you to do, and then you look back and then you see what kind of we can do. So in the end, there would be the compromise to push and to see. But for my side, I would like to see, commitment strengthened like this. I like to see more broader internal discussion before making this kind of commitment. Because this kind of commitment, I would see all of people sitting here, including myself, including a colleague like you, probably don't expect it. This is really unexpected, and they probably also pick up what time is the student announcement, because you might be thinking about before or after China-EU Green Deal Summit, or maybe COP27 next year in Glasgow. Actually, they also kind of think. But I find this timing is also not good. If you make your heart to yourself, I would like to see that you should bring some other big player to commit something hard for them, might be worthwhile. Otherwise, I think this is not the appropriate time to do that. Only good means the time is making a 45-year plan. This might be a good signal there. Otherwise, I wouldn't think anything a good time to do this.
Thanks, Professor. Gernot, you have a question. Probably you will ask it yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I guess you have partially already answered this question just now in response to Igor, but sort of this question of bottom-up, top-down targets versus bottom-up experimentation, right? So there's this, I'm going to mispronounce this now, but this concept of Shidian, sort of bottom-up experimentation, right, leading up to national goals. You know, other countries have this, right? European Union has subsidiarity principle, federalism in the US, where you experiment at the state level to then go up to a national target. But China in many ways has this much more formal than the US, let's say, does, where it's sort of informal experimentation. How do you think, how much of that figured into this top-down target, right? The 7 regional cap and trade trials, so these sorts of things, how does this add up?
You know, for the 7 carbon tradings, that one I myself also did a very thorough analysis, and basically I would say this is basically I see is a successful story, because it's China trying to have a carbon trading system wait very long, and also that learn quite a deal from the EU, because EU you know, is also the up down for this scheme, and this is also hearing all these economic terminals, and also making the system harder. I guess China watches very carefully, and also how officially also have the dialogue on this carbon levels. We also have the EU-funded project in China to do this. So I would say that based on the 7 pilot tradings, and then you see really build up the good basis for the MRVs and so on. But anyhow, is if you want to go beyond this 7 scheme, still very big hurdles. That's the reason when the government announced that, I don't know, that was announcement when the President Xi visited the US when the 2015 announced that China would have emission trading system by end of 2017. But you see already 2 or 3 years later, this is still not set up. Even now already quite well done before they think about 8 sectors. Now it's only considered about the power sectors, still not very real, because it's, if you want to have this kind of system, then you have to very should be how all the emission should be very accurate and verified, and then otherwise, and it will be very hard to say your price of carbon is comparable. And later on, if you want to link to other regions and you know, EU and Japan, and you know, if your price is accurate, not accurate, not reliable, that makes sense. But I would say that anyhow is now the government have this carbon neutralities, and if you take seriously, then question now is how to implement this, and also if you want to do that, you have to also look like still have 40 years to go. But given this is a very, I said, given very big change in the energy structure, and could be impact on the power mix, and also certainly also impact on economic structures. So this is something we have to do now, and based on the past economic reform, you will find this. If there's something easy to do, local government is relatively easy to collaborate. But if you are something very harder, you do see that the local government is not that always willing and active to cooperate, because notice it is a particular since 1993 when we have this tax sharing system between the central government and local government. Notice local government have much more consideration about the local economics and rather than the national economics. Although they are the communist leader, communist party members, sometimes they have to follow their party rules. But given you are the leader of local economics and responsible for local economics, sometimes notice and this kind of departure from the central government position, government orders also obvious to states. I guess this will be one of them. Particularly notice that economic growth is not go as fast as it used to be, and confrontation between China and the US, even Joe Biden take over, and I would say this is not the US-China confrontation will not over soon, and sometime I would say become even harder, because I expect the US and the EU and also allies, they might be dealing China in the more elegant and more elegant and based on the values, and that might be sometimes even harder compare to what President Trump is doing. So that reason we still have to wait to see what's going on.
Thanks a lot. So we are moving forward along our program, and I'm now switched to Russian because the next speakers will be Russian. And so all the English-speaking participants, please make sure that you choose the English language channel. You should push on the globe mark in the bottom of your Zoom panel. And so I myself am switching to Russian. Я перехожу на русский, и я рад передать слово Игорю.
I'm happy to give the floor to Igor Bashmakov, Executive Director of Center on Energy, Use of Power Energy. Igor Bashmakov is one of the key experts in climate change in Russia and decarbonization. He prepared analytical material for low-carbon strategy for Russia. The strategy is about to be adopted soon, and he will tell us about his vision of low-carbon development in Russia.
Ну да,
The
вот
floor
как
is
раз
yours.
заголовок примерно такой,
The
как ты
headline
сказал.
is
А начало моей
low-carbon
презентации сводится к
strategy
тому,
for
что
Russia,
вот
and at the
какую бы цель
outset,
стабилизации климата
I'll say
человечество
whatever
не выбрало,
goal in
фактически
climate
необходимо
stabilizing the
осуществить зеркальное
humankind
развитие по сравнению
chooses.
с траекторией business as usual. То есть если бы у
So,
нас развивалась ситуация
reverse
так, как она
development is
развивалась в последние
required
там,
compared to business as
20,
usual
30, 10
pathway.
лет, а у нас пока что снижение выбросов
In the
не
recent
происходит, кроме вот того,
years,
что мы наблюдали в
10
последний
to 30
год,
years,
нынешний.
there is
И,
no
кстати говоря,
reduction
это очень
in
интересный
emissions. What we
эффект. То есть, когда мы
only the
говорили о том,
recent
что
year
Россия
is
снижала
different.
выбросы в 90-х годах,
When we
все
speak
считали,
that
что это
Russia
горячий
reduced
воздух, что это
emissions
бесплатно, что это
in
вот
the 90s,
Россия
everybody
просто так,
thought
ничего не делая, снизила выбросы,
that
и поэтому
Russia
этот
did it
горячий
for
воздух
free,
ей
for
засчитывать не
nothing.
нужно и так далее.
So it
Вот сегодня этим
shouldn't be
горячим воздухом
counted.
наполнено снижение выбросов
But
во всех странах.
nowadays,
И мы можем примерно сказать, а
all the
сколько стоит вот
countries
такой способ
reduced
снижения выбросов.
emissions, and we can
Из
say
того, что
how
я
much
сегодня
this
услышал, у нас
reduction
получается,
of
что снижение
emissions
выбросов на
costs.
1%
What
стоит
I've heard
примерно
today,
1% глобального ВВП.
1%
И
of
если мы снижаем
emissions
выбросы
reductions
не за счет
costs
технологий,
1%
а
of
за счет
global
снижения
GDP
экономической
if we
активности,
reduce
за счет
emissions
снижения
not
своих
due to
потребностей,
technologies,
то,
but
что
due to
называется
reduction of
спрос.
economic
То есть
activities,
фактически мы
due to
сегодня
reduction
увидели,
in
что
our
самая дорогая
needs,
стратегия снижения
so-called
выбросов –
demand,
это
the
ограничение
most
экономического
costly
роста. Поэтому,
strategy of
когда мы
emission
говорим о том, что
reduction
нам
is
нужно
limiting
обеспечить вот такое
economic
зеркальное
growth.
развитие, мы имеем в
When we
виду, что
say
оно
that
должно
we
быть
need to
обеспечено
reverse
без
the
потери
trend,
заметной, во всяком случае, экономического роста.
we mean
И
that
если мы
no
говорим про такое
losses
развитие,
of
понятно,
economic
что
growth
если мы движемся
should
не
be
вверх, а
allowed.
будем двигаться вниз
If
по всем
we
этим секторам, которые
go
здесь
downward
нарисованы,
in all the
то у
sectors
нас
which are shown
структура рынка
here,
в 50-м
the
году
market
будет совершенно
structure
другая
in
по сравнению с тем, что
2050 will
вот она
be
сейчас собой
completely different
представляет. То
from
есть у нас
today.
разовьются очень крупные
We
рынки,
will have
которые сегодня
new
небольшие, а
big
те рынки, которые
markets
сегодня
which are small
доминируют, такие
today,
как, например,
and
ископаемые
the
топлива,
major
существенно
markets
развиваться не
today,
будут, а
as
скорее
of
всего даже
fossil
будут
fuel,
сжиматься. И по итогу у
will be
нас
shrinking,
низкоуглеродные
will
рынки по
not be
масштабу могут
developing, and
оказаться
low carbon
существенно выше,
markets
чем
can
те
become
традиционные рынки,
much
на
bigger
которые
than
привыкли экспортировать
traditional
свою
markets,
продукцию России.
where Russia
Обычно,
exports
когда мы
its
говорим о том,
products.
как влияет на
Usually, when
Россию
we speak
переход к
how
низкоуглеродному
Russia
развитию,
is
мы говорим про
affected
топливо.
by
Вот
low
здесь на этом
carbon
графике показано,
development
как
paths, we speak
могут
about fuel.
снижаться выбросы
This chart
промышленности глобальной,
demonstrates how emissions
при условии,
in
что
industries
промышленность к
worldwide
50-му или к
can
70-му году
reduce
примерно перейдет на низкоуглеродную траекторию
that
развития.
low carbon
Вот этими
pathway will
столбиками
be
здесь показан
adopted
вклад различных
worldwide by
технологий.
2050,
Понятно,
2070.
что он во времени меняется. Бледный верхний
Contribution of
столбик —
different
это
technologies is shown
декарбонизация
here.
электроэнергии,
The
за счет
upper
которой можно снижать косвенные выбросы
line
из
is
сектора промышленности. Но
decarbonizing of
главный
energy.
вывод вот из этого графика
But
состоит в том, что
the main
к середине
conclusion
века или,
from
может
the
быть, чуть
chart
позже на
is
рынках
that
практически не
by the
будет
middle
места
of the century
промышленной продукции
there
с
will
высокоуглеродным
be
следом.
no
То есть
room in the
нужно будет
market to the
уже
products
сегодня
with high
закладывать
carbon
основы для
component.
перехода к тому, чтобы мы в
Today we
середине века
should
или чуть позже,
create
так же,
the
как и все остальные, кто хочет
fundamentals
на этих рынках продавать свою продукцию,
that by the middle of
имели
the
возможность
century
продавать
we
продукцию с низкоуглеродным
have the
следом.
capacity
Вот на
to
этом графике
sell products
показано,
with
что
low
если мы
carbon
сегодня возьмем
component.
все наши
This chart
установки, мощности,
demonstrates
которые только есть, и будем
if
смотреть,
we
как они
summarize all
постепенно
our
будут выходить из эксплуатации за
production
счет их
facilities
износа,
today,
то мы видим,
and if
что
we
где-то
see
вот к
the
70-му году
decommissioning
практически все
because of
существующие
their
ныне
wear out,
источники
we
выбросов,
can
они
see
будут заменены
that
на
by
новые. И вопрос теперь
2070
возникает, на
all the
какие новые, а
sources
ответ
of
такой, что они
emissions
новые будут
of today
низкоуглеродные.
will be replaced by new
И если
sources. But what new
посмотреть вот на эти
sources? Low
графики,
carbon
где
sources.
показано
If
распределение
we look at the charts
производства базовых
that
материалов в
show
мире, производственных
distribution
мощностей по срокам
of production
возраста мощностей,
facilities in
сиреневые,
the
кстати,
world in
полоски — это
terms of
Россия,
the
а вот,
age.
кстати, красные полоски —
In
это
the
Китай,
purple
то мы
it's
видим, что в
Russia,
России
in the red
не
you
самые
can see
молодые
China, you
промышленные
can
активы,
see
и,
Russia
конечно, их
does
нужно
not
будет
have
менять, и
the
опять же вопрос,
youngest
на
industrial
какой
assets.
технологической основе
They
эта
need
замена
to be
будет
replaced,
производиться.
but the question is what technological
Понятно, что
foundation for
новые
replacement
технологии,
will be in
в том числе
place.
промышленные,
New
они стоят
technologies,
дороже. То есть если
including
мы вернемся вот
industrial
к этому
technologies,
графику, мы здесь
they
можем
cost
посмотреть
more.
стоимость
It's
разных
obvious.
технологий.
If
Вот
we look at the
бежевый — это
cost of
энергоэффективность, зеленый —
different
это материальная
technologies
эффективность,
on this chart,
бледно-зеленый — это циркуляционная экономика, такая
using
коричневая — это у нас
different industries, how
декарбонизация
much technologies
сырья для
cost. In
промышленности,
brown
синяя —
is
это
decarbonizing of
декарбонизация
raw
энергии, и
materials,
последнее — это
blue
у
is
нас
decarbonizing of
захват и
power
сохранение углерода. То
energy,
есть понятно, что для
and
того, чтобы
the
это
last one
обеспечить, страны
is
должны будут вводить в том
CCUS.
числе механизмы с ценой
The
на углерод,
countries will have
или
to
стимулировать развитие этих
introduce
технологий другими методами,
mechanisms of
например, через
carbon
госзакупки, и
pricing,
есть сегодня
or
большое
they
количество
have to
предложений использовать механизмы
incentivize other
стимулирования, которые
products,
использовались при
low
поддержке
carbon
развития возобновляемых
products,
источников энергии, но для того, чтобы
supporting
защитить
renewable
своих производителей, естественно,
energy
эти
sources,
государства
but
будут
the
вынуждены
states, in
вводить
order to
пограничные
protect
налоги
their
для того, чтобы их
manufacturers, will
бизнес не
have
ушел
to
из страны, чтобы
introduce
они не теряли
border
рабочие места,
taxes
чтобы
so
не
the
теряли доход и
businesses
так далее.
don't leave the
Это еще
countries,
один большой
so that
вызов.
no
Когда
income
все
is lost for
анализировали,
the
что будет
countries. It's one
происходить
more challenge.
при условии,
When
что
everybody
зеленая
review
сделка будет
what will
реализована, это
happen
была
if
интересная
Green
песня,
Deal
но
is
сегодня будет гораздо
implemented,
более интересная
it
песня,
was
когда Китай
interesting, but
начнет
today
осуществлять
it
вот то,
is
о
much
чем
more
нам только что
interesting what
рассказали.
will happen when
Если говорить про
China will
Россию
start
и про
implementing
опыт
what the
применения
presenter
низкоуглеродных
shared
технологий,
with us,
то
the
у нас,
previous
в принципе,
presenter,
опыт применения
about low
низкоуглеродных
carbon
технологий,
technologies in
хотя бы
Russia.
небольшой, есть
We
практически
have
везде.
some small
Но
experience
вот
of
он именно что
utilizing low
небольшой,
carbon
поэтому вот здесь красным
technologies
кружочком гораздо
everywhere,
больше, чем, например, в
but it's
Великобритании или в
not
мире в целом. То есть
big
мы все умеем
experience.
делать, но мы
We
не
can
умеем
do
это все
everything,
масштабировать.
but we
Не
cannot
умеем, не хотим, или по каким-то другим причинам у
increase
нас
the
это не масштабируется.
scales of our
Можно ли
experience
в
for
России
some
существенно
reason.
снизить
Is it
выбросы во
possible
всех
in
секторах
Russia
экономики?
to
Вот в той
reduce
работе, которую
significantly
Игорь упоминал,
emissions in
там
all
было
sectors
рассмотрено
of the
4
economy?
сценария. Конечно, не самый
In the work,
низкий
Igor
сценарий с
mentions
точки
4
зрения снижения
scenarios were
выбросов был
considered.
Минэкономразвития выбран для
Ministry of
формулировки
Economic
положений самой
Development
стратегии, но вот здесь как раз показаны
selected the middle
параметры динамики
scenario
вот
for
этого
its strategy, but
низкоуглеродного
you can
сценария.
see
И здесь важно еще
development
один очень
over
важный
time
момент
of this low
упомянуть,
carbon
что
scenario. And
когда
what
эта
is
работа делалась,
important,
она делалась силами
when
достаточно
this
большой группы
work
специалистов, более
was
20
being created,
специалистов, и в
more
том
than
числе мы
20
опрашивали
experts were working
многих
on it.
специалистов по целому
We
ряду направлений, но
interviewed
пока что у нас
many
то, что вот мы
specialists
сейчас слышали о Китае,
regarding
видение
number of
будущего,
areas.
да, у
What
нас
we've
очень
heard
робкое видение
today about
будущего с точки
China,
зрения
vision of
проникновения
the future.
низкоуглеродных технологий. Ну,
We
когда,
have
например, мы
a very
спрашивали,
modest
а
vision
какой
of the
максимальная доля выработки ВИИ может быть в 2050 году, все называли достаточно робкие цифры. То есть вот у нас такого более смелого видения будущего, не даже в экспертном сообществе пока что нет. По теплоэнергии тоже есть возможности большие снижения потребления тепла в жилых зданиях. Об этом можно специально говорить. Причем в жилых зданиях сроки окупаемости многих мероприятий 3-4 года, стоимость снижения выбросов парниковых газов отрицательная. И если есть механизмы поддержки, которые сегодня у нас, правда, в очень ограниченном масштабе правительство осуществляет, то обходится примерно такая поддержка $4 за тонну снижения СО2. Таким образом, промышленность. Вот в промышленности у нас тоже есть возможности, несмотря на то, что этот весь прогноз рассчитан практически на рост экономики в 2,5 раза, и это очень оптимистические допущения прогноза, которые Минэкономразвития заложило в техническое задание для разработки этих сценариев. Наша экономика вряд ли будет так динамично развиваться, но если даже она так вот динамично будет развиваться, то мы имеем возможность, несмотря на это, снизить выбросы парникового газа, прямые и косвенные. Прямые вообще значительно, косвенные чуть поменьше, но снижение промышленности тоже достаточно значительно. На транспорте можно очень существенно преломить тенденции и динамику потребления энергии, и выбросы, и структуру парка автомобилей. Вот здесь в графике нарисовано. Все это реализуемо. Здания то же самое. Мы можем существенно увеличивать, как я говорил. Вот у нас сегодня объем капитальных ремонтов по энергоэффективным проектам многоквартирных домов составляет 0,1%. То есть мы будем 1000 лет модернизировать наши дома по энергоэффективным проектам для того, чтобы мы могли их довести до такого более-менее энергоэффективного состояния. Если мы такие вот меры не будем пересматривать, не будем такую политику пересматривать, то этот процесс будет очень медленно продвигаться. А в принципе здесь, возможно, есть большие возможности с точки зрения повышения энергоэффективности и с точки зрения децентрализованной выработки электроэнергии и тепловой энергии в зданиях. Это и электроэнергия, это и тепловая энергия через тепловые насосы, тепловая энергия через солнечные водоподогреватели и так далее. То есть здесь тоже есть достаточно большие возможности. По итогу, вот, если мы рассмотрим этот сценарий, мы можем видеть с учетом мер по лесовосстановлению, что Россия могла бы свои выбросы к 50 году держать примерно на уровне 22% от 90-го года. То есть, еще раз говорю, что это не самые такие агрессивные допущения, достаточно реалистичные, достаточно умеренные, тем не менее, вот при такой ситуации, в зависимости от того, насколько мы будем заниматься лесовосстановлением, мы могли бы примерно иметь от 20 до 1/3 от выбросов, которые у нас были в 90-м году, к 2050 году. То есть возможности у России есть, если бы мы задавались такими целевыми установками, про которые мы сейчас слышали, установлены сейчас этот ориентир в Китае, то мы бы эти все решения нашли. Пока что вот у нас указ президента такой, что мы практически можем ничего не делать до 30-го года, и мы спокойно выполним свои обязательства. Дополнительные усилия не нужны, тем более, что, скорее всего, экономика, в том числе из-за коронавируса, будет развиваться гораздо медленнее, чем было заложено в прогнозе Министерства экономического развития, который был заложен в основу этого сценария. Но здесь еще важный один очень момент. Без модернизации, как я вот вначале показывал, не будет экономического роста, а значит и не будет существенного роста выбросов именно по этой причине. При динамичной модернизации...
I apologize.
Просто переводчик накладывается на ваш голос для англоязычных слушателей. Внизу перевод, кнопочка есть с глобусом. Там надо нажать на нее и выбрать русский канал.
Вот.
Нашли в самом низу перевод. Такая кнопочка.
Please select the Russian channel.
Не вижу я кнопочку с глобусом.
Так, а вы можете тогда, наверное, выключить ваш экран сначала перестать, и тогда оно появится. А потом заново запустить экран.
Я уже практически закончил, Игорь.
Ну, просто наши слушатели англоязычные слушают одновременно и вас, и переводчика, и ничего не понятно из-за этого.
Нет у меня этого глобуса.
Ну ладно, давайте попробуем довести до конца, а потом, когда вы вот сейчас попробуйте ниже, в самом низу.
Ну вот у меня стоп, видео, mute, more. Сейчас я попробую на всю катушку. Вот нашел, просто у меня не весь экран выражен. Так, что я должен нажать?
Русский язык.
Так.
Сейчас должно быть хорошо. Если вы выбрали русский канал, должно быть хорошо. Извините, да, но заново запустите экран.
Проверим. Ну, мы пришли почти к концу, и в этот момент мы, значит, решили останавливаться.
We are approaching the conclusion. In fact, this is my favorite picture. Can we increase GDP by more than a factor of 2, keeping our dirty economy with high emissions of greenhouse gases? The answer is simple. It's impossible. We can have some minor growth, but it's impossible to achieve a major growth. In order to progress, we will need technological modernization, we will need to reach new markets with new low-carbon products using new technologies. Only in this case, we will be able to ensure economic growth. If we look what was happening with Russia's economic growth from 2008 to today, we actually haven't had growth on the old commodity model. There is room for development. I demonstrated the scenario on emission reduction, but still we try to agree with expert community what is plausible, and we can achieve more notable reduction of emissions for the future. Setting such goals is important because without technological renovation, as I showed, without transfer to low carbon products, we will not have a spot for ourselves. Barriers will prevent us from entering these markets. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Please ask your questions, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. What, in your view, is the main political economy barrier for implementing the goals of the political will of the authorities or lobbyists of power companies? The main potential is in the companies which have might have benefits from power energy efficiency. So Russia could have a low carbon future, could solve a number of questions, but what are the main maybe bureaucratic hurdles or political and economic hurdles which need to be overcome? I would name 3 of them. First, we have a lot of pessimists, we have too few optimists. Optimists are those who advocate low carbon development, and pessimists are people who deal with coal, gas and oil. We have much more people in these areas, and they are much more powerful. If you look why no goal of reducing by 3% more, was adopted in new executive order, it was done because of the pressure of oil and gas business. The business does not understand there are not only risks in low carbon development, but there are opportunities as well. The producers of nickel, aluminium, and other materials can increase their markets due to such low carbon development. The companies who want to maintain their current niches, they should understand that they may not maintain these niches without transfer to low carbon economy. If China joined this trend, Japan, Western Europe, we should see that nothing is possible to reverse. You whether join the trend, you cannot go in the different direction counterclockwise. So the first point, business community gradually starts through the risks of border adjustment of carbon. They start understanding this is the issue which needs to be tackled. And secondly, we don't have sufficient support from the population. First, the population does not have enough information, and there is much false information. Some people don't have real knowledge in the area, but then they start explaining to others why the specialists who advocate for climate change measures are wrong. Although the whole of the population, which was conducted a year ago, demonstrated that 52% of our population think that climate change issues are serious. But so far, there is no substantial pressure on the authorities. People don't think these are priority issues for them. And the next point, orientation to the future. We have a number of studies which demonstrate that Russian people are looking at preserving, maintaining the status quo than developing something new, instead of analyzing how new markets can be reached, which new market niches can be captured. Gazprom, for example, is developing hydrogen area. Rusal company is developing low carbon aluminium, but still this area is mainly ignored. And one more point, qualified personnel. The question is how many people deal with this issue, how many people are deeply involved in this issue. We need to have a lot of trained specialists so that they have good expertise and make right decisions. We hear a lot about power efficiency. I deal with power efficiency for 30 years. Now we have a decrease of interest to this. The government demonstrates some interest to that. After 2010, we created some institutions, we trained some personnel. Then that policy was put on hold, and the trained specialists left these projects, and we don't have many trained specialists who could implement those projects. We have specialists in these areas, but there are not in many of them compared to the demands of our country. We need people who have practical experience of implementing such projects. Regarding, for example, changes in the buildings, there are not many people who understand all aspects of a building, its components, and so on, to change these. Thank you very much. Let me add, in the recent year, the interest to climate issues in Russia has grown, of course, due to the carbon duties the EU is saying it can impose. Of course, there are positive trends in the behavior of many Russian companies. Many of them are adopting long-term climate strategies. Let's hope this progress will continue, although it is progressing slower than we would like to see. But of course, like you mentioned, more and more countries declare the plans of carbon neutrality. They say that in long-term perspective, they will not buy fossil fuels, and Russia cannot ignore this trend. Maybe this will facilitate the shift in the policy, to shift towards a low-carbon policy. Dear colleagues, do you have any more questions to Igor Alexeyevich? If not, let me take the floor. The next speaker I will be presenting, it will be about a different topic. It will be about the global agenda, international climate cooperation. Its topic is bridging the gaps in the polycentric climate change regime. The presentation will be based mainly on the chapter which I wrote in the middle of this year in the book which was published after a conference with other colleagues. Adrian Pabst was one of my colleagues in this article. Climate change is considered as a tragedy of common resources, the situation when each country, each stakeholder following its own individual interest, it increases volumes of emissions, but it undermines the common good, and climate change continues, and it causes overall economic losses. There are three approaches. Pigouvian solution to impose some tax, some penalty for excessive use of common resource. Such an approach is used in many countries who are introducing carbon tax. If there is a Cousian solution, it is about specification of property rights. The state clearly establishes who is supposed to have and what part of common resource. For example, is a cap-and-trade system which is applied at the national level in many countries, and in international level, this Caucasian solution was applied in Kyoto Protocol. Each country has some limitations, legally binding limitations in terms of emissions. They were legally binding because the country, but they were provisional because the country did not have any penalties or responsibilities if it did not comply with the protocol, but there was an opportunity to implement projects in other countries, in developing countries, and consider reduction of emissions in its territory as following meeting the obligations. There is post-com solution. It's related to common resources strategy. Paris Agreement was the outcome of this, because countries established their goals, their common goals. There are no restrictions in emissions. Every country sets its goals based on its plans of developing economies and power industries. Within the framework of this approach, Paris Agreement gives a big role to non-state actors. It assumes that not only the state should deal with reduction of emissions, but private companies, municipal authorities, regional authorities. This approach is implemented in practice. We can see that many companies adopt low carbon goals, low carbon strategies. Many regions do that, including in the countries which don't have national carbon regulations. We can see many banks and investment funds dealing with climate risks. Investment funds select investments strategies based on climate experiences. So there is a polycentric climate regimen. There is no single decision-making center. There is no some coordinating mechanism like global government which implements climate policy. This climate policy is implemented in regions, companies, by investors, and so on. One of the regiments is, which is unfolding, is the asymmetry of different parties. There are two types of countries: enthusiastic countries,
which are at the head of this policy, driving it forward, making considerable efforts to achieve those goals. But also other countries that are countering this with different types of activity. Among these countries, which also differ from each other, some countries appear to be not against this, even say they're supportive, but they also say they have other priorities, such as development. So they claim, yes, we want to reduce emissions, but our priorities at the moment are otherwise, such as countries such as India, Brazil, South Africa, but also other countries such as Russia, which are sort of countering this because they see this in reduction of emissions a threat to the economic model. It's not like they're not prepared to do emissions. They're prepared to do emissions, but they only will do it, they're forced to do it. Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, those are the cases, examples of such countries. And the bad news is that the dynamics of emissions in the world is determined mostly by those countering countries, opposing countries. If we take away China, which of course is increasingly part of the number of the enthusiastic countries, for the most part, enthusiastic countries, they have stable dynamics of emissions, even decreasing, but their share in the overall amount of emissions is quite small, about 40% if we take away China. And that share is getting smaller with every year. But for the most part, emissions are increasing in the countries that are not so well developed, and the kind of reluctant countries, opposing countries. So on the one hand, there's activity of developed countries, and in part of China too. It's increasing very much. And the readiness to cut down emissions is increasing, but the share of those countries is getting smaller, particularly if you take away China, change the picture dramatically. But even with China in, the share of the enthusiastic countries is getting smaller. So overall, the situation is driven by other countries. They're not so well prepared to reduce the emissions. That affects international trade, because there are countries which are net importers, net importers of emissions as part of the finished products. Those are mostly well-developed countries, OSRE countries. At the same time, there are countries that are net exporters of carbon products, mostly BRICS countries. They are in a counter phase. So the importers don't produce such products, but they import a lot. Whilst BRICS countries, just the opposite, they're exporters of such products. They are specialized in this, and they carry out corresponding emissions. So as OSRE countries are moving towards neutrality, the gap between these two groups of countries is going to increase further and further. So the hopes are resting with China that this gap may be bridged between production-based and consumption-based emissions. That's to say, between exporter countries that exporting finished products and importers that import finished products. So these inputs help us to formulate three main gaps in the international climate regulations. The gaps not in the sense that this regime regulation was international regime regulation was adopted, and then maybe it turned out there were some gaps in it. No, the gaps in the sense that weakness of such climatic regime, which needs to be addressed. First, it's what's referred to as an enforcement gap. That's a gap relating to compelling. There are no sanctions as part of this international regime for countries that kind of they're not ready to reduce emissions. No, there are no sanctions as part of such regime. If any country is not willing to reduce emissions, there's nothing that can be done about it as part of the international agreements. Second gap was referred to as linkage gap. It's a kind of contradiction between the goals of combating climate change and other goals of development, particularly where the reluctant countries are concerned. It's most manifest in countries such as India, that actually claim directly that they need to deal with poverty, they need more power generated, and there can be. And it's not possible for India to provide all energy from green sources, so they need to rely on gas until they resolve other issues such as the issue of poverty. So the problem of combating climate changes doesn't quite fit well with resolving issues of poverty, energy poverty. So there's some contradiction to be found there, which, as part of Paris Agreement, is not being addressed. And the final gap is the gap in climate financing. Again, in the countries which are not the enthusiastic countries, there's a shortage of capital, and there's not enough motivation to fund low carbon projects. So not enough financial resources to do it now, or maybe other priorities that override this, which would be a follow-up on the previous gap, linkage gap. Typically, most financing is concentrated in the enthusiastic countries where emissions are being reduced. So what to do about this? What are the ways and means of combating and overcoming such gaps? There are quite a lot of such ways and methods which tend to complement each other, and some of them are being put in place. Now, the gap of enforcement, the gap of compelling is into the rolling out of investment mechanisms. That's what the European Union is trying to do. In the absence of sanctions as part of Paris Agreement, but those sanctions may be rolled out under other names, such as barriers for particular industries or done by particular governments or by banks when taking decision on funding particular projects. This is already being done. Russian business has to deal with this already, mostly in the case of European Union, but most likely it will be done by other counterparties too. Besides introduction of carbon adjustments mechanisms, there's also various self-regulation mechanisms in different industries, industry-specific regulations with tougher requirements on low carbon products. So we're close to the day where goods may not be allowed on the markets with a kind of carbon index that's too high. Also, companies that are doing divestments from dirty industries, getting together with the international investors and taking decisions on moving investments away from fossil fuel industries. That's also one way of filling the gap of compelling of enforcement. Very important solution to address the problem of linkage, which is a connection with other problems of development. There's much that needs to be promoted here, developed. It's related to the fact that climate regime does have enough attention to the problems of transportations. So far, the developed countries don't have much motivation to share technologies with the developing countries. So there's a big gap of regulation. The different mechanisms are possible here. For example, Japanese mechanism is well known of trust technologies, green technologies being handed over to other countries for those countries to use those technologies. It's likely that China will be participating in this process by spreading green technologies, among others, as part of the Silk Way initiative. There may be a role for international organizations such as the World Bank and transportation schemes. Much needs to be done here. Of course, ideal solution to this problem of linkage as well as enforcement, and at the same time the problem of climatic funding would be international system, global system of green funding of climatic projects, which could be connected with the system of offsets adopted in the systems regulations of advanced countries. Basically, European companies could do projects tagged as green, maybe relating to some international centers, India, Russia, China, and it could be as credits of obligations for a reduction of emissions. Something similar was envisioned as part of the Kyoto Protocol, but it was more narrow, and it basically came to nothing. So the logic behind such system of global funding would be quite simple. A reduction of emissions in the developing world is much cheaper per unit of emissions compared to the advanced countries where emissions have been largely extensively prohibited. And so the costs are going higher as those countries move towards neutrality, whilst in other countries, developing countries, the costs of emissions are much cheaper. So if one could use mechanism of green funding to make use of the capital of developed countries, that would be great, I think. But so far, we're far away from this arrangement. And the final item relating to COVID-19, much discussed now. which something I didn't foresee when I was writing up this paper, but which is now is emerging more and more clearly. It's a question of debts. Now, as part of the Great 20 of G20, there's a lot of discussion on what to do with the debts of developing countries. And one of the mechanisms for writing of debts could be creating conditions where debts could be written off as part of maybe commitments towards green development, towards implementation of some low-carbon projects. This is an opportunity that didn't exist before, but has now emerged. So these three gaps, enforcement gap, linkage gap, and climate finance gap, they are the key ones in this climatic regime. So the climatic agreement as a framework mechanism within which everybody is cutting down emissions from bottom up is more effective compared to the mechanism envisioned by Kyoto Protocol from top to bottom to down. But these mechanisms need to be implemented jointly. So far, there's more active movement towards overcoming the first gap of reinforcement, mostly through negative incentives, setting up barriers. But not much is being done. The other two gaps. And we as expert community, among others, need to pay more attention to these. So I conclude my presentation with this. I've received a few questions, which I'll try to answer. First, not all low carbon technologies have been tested, and like hydrogen, for instance. Of course, hydrogen is just in the early stages of its development. There are lots of issues with safety and other issues. So far, the very few large-scale projects in the area of hydrogen energy. There's an issue of safety is one of the gaps there. But this is a specific question relating to hydrogen-based energy. As for renewable energy, there's also lots of gaps to do with this, security and safety, which have yet to be overcome, to do with accumulation of energy, with transmission of energy. But by and by, these will be overcome. And if these issues are addressed quickly, then the hydrogen energy will work fast enough. There's also a problem of investments. Yes, that's one of the reasons why mechanisms of Kyoto Protocol were basically abolished. Because those mechanisms were not effective in terms of environment and were simply implemented by companies that were going to cut down on emissions anyway, probably. So it's to do with the issues of accounting, openness, investments, and other barriers specific to developing economies. Suppose some green standards, if they are made universal, to some extent, they will go some way to overcome those problems, even though it will still remain. But this, as I said, is the reason why it's not taken into account as within the European Union. But if we look at this as the problem of rich countries, in any case, there should be some cross mechanisms that should be put in place, notwithstanding the difficulties that there may be, that we may have there, even including those to do with the low effectiveness. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for your report. I have a question. You mentioned three problems. Relative to the current climate regime, which is good, but one needs to move towards improving it. Now, to what extent the Paris Agreement how conducive is it to those solutions? It would appear there are no barriers there. There's provisions for helping developing countries. There's provisions for enhancing enforcement, for engaging greater number of participants, for, among other things, for transport technologies. But there's something that's not there. You also mentioned emissions are taken into account from manufacturing, not from consumption. So if, globally speaking, if technological regime will be redirected towards accounting more for consumption, at least to a great extent, that might help address the issues that you've spoken of. To what extent the Paris Agreement is conducive to addressing these issues? Because being oriented towards kind of old standards, I don't think a Paris Agreement is in the way of this. Because just like countries declare their commitments, they actually go ahead and reduce their emissions. If any country wants to cut down emissions from consumption rather than production, there's no barriers to that. But as far as the mechanisms of accounting, standards of accounting, which are shared by all the countries, since dating back to the UN Convention, of course, they pay more attention to manufacturing as opposed to emissions from consumption, which there's a logic behind this, because emissions from manufacturing is easier to calculate compared to, it's kind of difficult to calculate effectively consumption emissions or consumption-related emissions. But one could take into account consumption more. So I don't suppose Paris Agreement would be in the way. It would be the affair of individual countries. Another thing is that the countries are not particularly trying to do it. Russia is one of the countries that could do more on this. But could Russia perhaps come forward with consolidated agenda from BRICS countries or other net exporters, and maybe claiming that the next goal of emission reductions here now, 2 years from now, could be reformulated in terms of consumption, not just in terms of manufacturing. So maybe Russia could act not just alone, but could actually act as, if Russia tried to act alone, it would not be appropriate. But if Russia could get together with 4 or 5 other countries and try to put forward this kind of agenda for consumption-related emissions reductions, I would be in favor of such initiatives inside BRICS too. But of course, for this, to this end, Russia would need to make its policy more active. Then it could be, its voice could be heard more. So far, Russia is seen as a player that would likely be promoting its individual agenda. So if you take a look at BRICS countries, it's hard to see Russia promoting its agenda for relative to China, because China is emerging in the leading positions. So it could be only possible if Russia tried to make efforts to reduce emissions, both manufacturing and consumption, domestically, in this case. Another thing is that Russia could offer a calculation of consumption emissions, but if we make records since 1990, which is what Russia has insisted on, claiming that we've had the biggest emission reduction since 1990, but our indicators on consumption would be not as good. Another thing that if our goal is neutrality, then consumption emissions, which there are less in our case in absolute terms, which to say they're easier to reduce. But so far, our goal dating back to 1990, and so Russia would not likely be interested in having consumption emissions since 1990. as opposed to manufacturing emissions. That would be my answer. Are there any other questions or comments? One short comment. You indicated 3 problems. The difference in the effectiveness of the use of methods. Where, the question, where it would be effective to use it, in which territory, I would say there are 4 issues. And you're quite right that the interests of Russia tend to differ depending on the method of calculation. But if under conditions of recession or pandemic, to start calculations from start, like a new epoch, new thinking, then we would talk about neutrality, of course, in the long term. Then there will be questions for US and China and Europe. The question about dynamics, not about dynamics of slogans. The question is that with big emissions, one needs to address the issues of climate in countries where a lot of, the China has settled its those problems, but it has 6 times as much emissions as Russia. So by 2060, so there's still it's a possibility that emissions might be increasing in China by until the year 2030. So we have Europe that will try to consolidate its emissions, manufacturing emissions by 2030, while China might well be increasing the emissions by 2030. So there's a big disconnect. So the use of governance and of regulation and agreements, so it emerges as a separate issue. If you want to do something, we need to do it jointly, not piecemeal. I don't think such problems could be addressed piecemeal. Yes, I agree. Reductions should be done where it's cheapest, and the cheapest it's where they increase. That's where they're cheaper to decrease. Where emissions are going down anyway, the technology is already in place. It's not as relevant. Yes, there's an attempt at addressing the global issues at the national level, which of course is not possible. So you're quite right. What I tried to show that some countries have funding where cutting down of emissions is expensive and it's not as relevant because emissions are not so great to begin with. But there's other countries where emissions are increasing and there are more and more opportunities for low carbon projects. And those are the kinds that drive dynamics of climate change. How to connect this? So far, there's no progress on this score, because it's clear that the advanced countries, they're not likely to be interested in providing funding for emission reduction, say in Russia or elsewhere. It's hard to expect money for Russia under current conditions, but my final comment would be, people tend to forget that one needs to funding not just for technologies, but also for social adaptation of miners and mining regions. Those are millions of people, in particular in Poland, who vote for the government party. So it's not just a technological issue, it's also the problem of mining regions. In Russia would be Makarov region, or look at the regions in Indonesia or India. That's a separate issue altogether, which people tend to skirt when they discuss this. So it's like it's being assumed that those things will get sorted out by themselves and miners will go someplace. I asked, put this question. Where are those Madam Thatchers that closed down small miners' villages? Where are those people to close down those regions all across the world? So it's a colossal decision. So So the China might do it, but other countries not so rich, like Russia. It's a big issue. It's not just the issue of producing energy. It's a issue of revenue, taxation, political configurations. It's much bigger problem, and it's far too important just to be given to ecologists to deal with.
Если, коллеги, нет никаких замечаний, то у нас как-то уже подходит время-то.
Okay, if there are no questions, then we're coming to conclusion of our session. We have 2 more reports. Let's pass the floor to Ilya Stepanov, head of the Laboratory of Climate Changes at High School of Economics.
Презентацию на английском. Сейчас я канал поменял, правильно? И теперь на...
Let me switch to English.
Да, сейчас. И теперь демонстрацию экрана включаю. Yes. So, dear colleagues, one more time, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conference. It's a great pleasure to be this year together with you. So my presentation will raise upon the topic which was outlined in the program. I will talk about the fossil fuel exporting countries under the pressure of low carbon transition, and we'll focus mainly on carbon pricing issues. We'll say a few words about Russia. So my presentation is a sort of combination of research by myself and my colleagues at the Laboratory for Climate Change Economics at HSE. So let me start from what academic literature says about fossil fuel exporting countries and general problems which they face. So first of all, this is the dependence on natural resource exports exposes countries to volatile commodity markets that generate macroeconomic stability. It's sort of one of the problems outlined in the literature on the regular basis. Another one is that capital inflows which are typically associated with fossil fuel extraction raise the real exchange rate and could reduce the competitiveness of the rest of the economy. It's also one of the classical economic problems which these countries could face. So, and finally, the concentration of large resource rents can result in poor governments, which in the longer run can undermine the economic performance. But on top of that, which relate to the sessions which we have today, there is a climate-related risks, which our fossil fuel exporting countries are being more and more affected by. And this is not only physical impacts of climate change associated with weather-related events, but also its macrostructural risks of a global transition to low-carbon development. Igor Makarov just partly mentioned the trends which we can observe nowadays. First of all, it's the reduced demand for fossil fuel exports. So the demand for fossil fuels is not growing at the same speed as it was 10 years before. So the second one is that these countries are challenged by reduced demand for fossil fuel assets. So there is a growing trend in divestments from coal and more often from oil industry assets, an increasing number of entities sort of signaling their plans that they will withdraw assets from carbon-intense projects nowadays. And finally, fossil fuel technologies are at increasing speed being competed by low-carbon technologies, including electricity technologies, storage, smart grids, renewable energy, etc. So, but at the same time, it's not a big surprise that emissions reduction, as we were discussing today in fossil fuel exporting countries and developing countries, can be both politically and economically challenging, since emissions reduction is associated with high opportunity costs for the fossil fuel, for fuel and energy complex for related industries, and could lead to the reduction in international competitiveness of national business in the short run. So, and both academic literature and our studies show that fossil fuel exporting countries and countries with higher resource rents tend to have less ambitious climate policies. At the same time, energy security concerns and goals to decrease energy imports can be another motives for energy importing countries. So in these countries, they could drive climate policy and could strengthen these climate policies. So energy importing countries and countries with lower energy self-sufficiency tend to have more ambitious emissions reduction targets and use more advanced instruments of climate policy like carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is the thing I would like to focus today, since it's becoming increasingly popular both at national and regional scale. So in academic literature, carbon pricing, as Gerhard Wagner said, is considered, and what literature said, of course, is considered to be one of the most cost-efficient means to emissions reduction. So the World Bank annually accumulates information on all the initiatives around the world on carbon pricing implemented at level of regions, at level of states. As for today, there are already 60 initiatives like this, where the carbon pricing is introduced either in the form of carbon tax or emission trading scheme. So, however, only 9 out of 60 carbon pricing initiatives which are implemented globally are implemented by fossil fuel exporting entities, either regions or countries. So there are some like Canada, some Canadian provinces like British Columbia, Alberta, Australia. Of course, it is Norway that uses carbon price starting from 1991. And there are a few developing countries like South Africa and Kazakhstan, which had some troubles with emissions allocating system and had to freeze the ETS, but it has just been restarted recently. So this brings me to the central point of my presentation. So there are basically 2 ways of emissions reduction. In the energy sector, we can either reduce energy consumption or we can switch to less carbon-intense energy sources. And carbon pricing is basically so attractive, both politically and in economic literature, because it allows to use both ways of emissions reduction, both channels of emissions reduction. However, especially in energy exporting countries, especially in developing countries, energy consumption is directly linked to economic growth, so any measures to restrict energy consumption may hinder economic growth. So that's why a gradual switch to less carbon-intense energy sources represents a more promising options, especially in the light of COVID-19 and the need to recover from this crisis. So the possible way out is not a high carbon price for these countries, but rather a carbon balanced energy taxation system, which is not the same thing. So more carbon balanced energy taxation system implies energy taxation which is more proportional to carbon intensity of different energy products like coal, oil products, and natural gas. So, and this is not the same thing as a carbon price being introduced just on top of the existing fiscal infrastructure in the energy sector. So this brings me to the one more research which we're developing right now. It's a little bit different view on carbon pricing. This view is now being gradually developed and shared by OECD. So in one of the research, we calculate the so-called implicit carbon price, which consists of direct carbon price, which is created by carbon tax in different countries, and price at emission trading scheme. So this is sort of a direct price put on carbon with regard to carbon content of different types of energy products and fuels. So, but indirect carbon price is sort of the general energy taxes on fossil fuel use in the country with no regard to content, to carbon content of an energy product. So this picture basically shows the value of implicit carbon price in European countries. So you can see that the highest are in Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, the lowest one in Bulgaria, Poland, Czech Republic. I wouldn't say a lot about this picture because it's a bit different story, but so we run a series of panel regression models, and the general output of these regressions is that energy taxes, which are not differentiated based on the carbon context by themselves, could be a strong instrument for emissions reduction and can be quite a solid base for climate policies in the countries which are not ready for high carbon price implemented on top of everything. So both direct and indirect carbon price, according to this research, contribute to statistically significant and comparable emissions reduction. So no statistical significant differences between the impact of both group found. So this brings me to the discussion that the solution for low carbon strategies in fossil fuel exporting countries would be, first of all, to work with the existing energy taxation system by introducing sort of not a carbon price, but the elements of direct carbon price into the extensive body of energy taxation, because fossil fuel exporting countries traditionally have a broad energy taxation system which help them collect revenues for a state budget. So the key solution would be to work with these taxes rather to implement something with no regard to this system. So, and just to follow up with regard to Russia. So it was mentioned today several times that Russia, being a fossil fuel exporting country, finds itself under the growing pressure of low carbon trends. First of all is that climate-related actions outside Russia will lower country's GDP growth rate by 1.5 percentage point by 2030. This is basically due to the trends in global demand for fossil fuels, which are not favorable for Russian exporters. And the second challenge, which is becoming more burning nowadays, is the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is scheduled to be introduced before 2023, which will bring losses to Russian exporters of carbon intense goods. There are different estimates already available, but one of them, produced by KPMG, says that the losses would be $5 billion annually. Russia ratified Paris Agreement and gradually developed the normative base. Maybe the speed is not enough to be in line with all these trends, but this is all we have. Opportunities of carbon pricing is now being discussed. However, introduction of high carbon price nowadays is not a solution, obviously. Rising price, there are risks of rising price levels and falling real incomes of the population, which is totally not a political option in the light of COVID. We can say about the risks of declining international competitiveness of carbon-intense industries, which are vital for Russian economy and its recovery. So the possible way out is to look at the existing taxes in the energy complex. And this is the picture in the right, shows the implicit carbon price calculated as revenues from mineral extraction tax per ton of CO2 emissions from oil, natural gas, and coal combustion. So we can basically see that this is an exponential axis. So we can see the disproportions in taxation of different types of energy products with regard to Russian main energy tax, which accounts for 75% of all state revenues, energy revenues, except for export duty. But we can see, if we compare, for example, natural gas and coal, that coal is taxed 20 times less than natural gas, which shows a great potential for making the energy taxation in Russia more climate friendly and so-called more carbon balanced. So let me stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention. I'll be glad to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Your approach is interesting. It tries to capture the Russian specifics As it was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, no examples has been in place of successful pricing for hydrocarbons in the country's fossil fuel dependence, and energy taxation and attempts to work with taxation and energy complex are more plausible. It can be a good first step, the manipulating with carbon, with oil and gas prices as such. Dear colleagues, please ask questions, or maybe you have some comments.
There is a question from Franziska. Franziska, probably you will read it yourself. Okay. Or I should do it. Okay. Thank you for this great presentation. Can you say something about what role of fossil fuel subsidy reform should have for moving towards a carbon-balanced energy taxation system? Subsidies seem to be especially prevalent in fossil fuel producing countries, where they are sometimes seen as a part of the social contract. Yes, what about subsidies, energy subsidies in Russia?
Yes, thank you, Franziska. It's especially important in Russia and with regard to Russia, because this huge disproportion of implicit carbon price calculated for different types of fuels is not only the story about that the taxes for natural gas is high, the taxes for coal is low. It's all about subsidy as well. So the coal is hugely subsidized in Russia nowadays, and it's exactly one of the key areas where we can make some changes, moving towards a more carbon balanced system in general. So the approach would be to look at the system as a whole and to move directly, move directly to more carbon balanced system, making it different decisions. Like it can be elements of carbon price where it is possible, where there is interfuel competition in some probably electricity segments in some regions in Russia, but it could be vast, like the number of other solutions, and the subsidy solutions, subsidy reform solution could make a big difference here. Thank you.
Yes, I may add that it is very difficult to calculate even subsidies in Russia, energy subsidies, I mean, because many of them have indirect form. If you look at the statistic basis of OECD, for example, or other international statistic basis, you will see that coal is nearly not subsidized in Russia. That is wrong, because coal is heavily subsidized, but not directly, but indirectly through, for example, different discounts for railroads tariffs, or discounts for like pension payments of coal companies and so on. So these are not direct subsidies for coal companies, but they actually improve the competitiveness of coal. So taking into account all these subsidies, it is a very difficult task. And I know that some research groups in different parts of the world try to do it for Russia. Probably next year we will have some results, but I have some doubts that they will succeed, because it is really a very comprehensive issue. This system of subsidies, it has been built for many years, and it is very complex and comprehensive, and just calculate them, it is a very difficult task. But yes, doing something with energy subsidies should be one of the first steps for energy transition in Russia. It's quite logical. Okay, any other questions? Еще вопросы? Хорошо, тогда мы переходим.
Okay, let us move on to the last presentation for today. We have two co-authors, Leonid Grigoryev and Dzhanneta Medzhidova, a professor of World Economy Department. Dzhanneta will be speaking. We are handing the presentation in more reliable hands, and she'll be speaking in English, I'd like to stress as an introduction, this article has been completed. It's now in verification process. In December, a special issue will be published of Russian Journal of Economics, the last issue for this year, a special issue related to energy industry. This article and the article by Mr. Makarov and one article by Jonathan Stan, key specialist in natural gas in the world, will be published. An article by Manfred Hanfner will be published. The article by Kirsten from Westphalis, Berlin on Russian-German relations will be published. Manfred will write an article about energy transition, and there is an interesting author. Two specialists from Arabic specialist and Belgian specialist, they wrote an article about geopolitics in the area of renewable energy. And our article will be published as well. 7 articles will be accessible in English within 2 weeks. Last verification is underway. I am a guest editor there. Thank you so much. Dzhanneta, I'm giving the floor to you. Leonid Markovich, thank you very much.
Let me briefly describe the structure. Well, first of all, some definitions. I'll remind you about global energy trilemma and present our definition, and about energy transition process. Then a short insight into the current state of global energy trilemma. Then we'll dive into global emissions, investments angle, and finally, I'll probably try to explain what is the possible influence of COVID-19, although it was heavily discussed today. Okay, so the concept of global energy trilemma has first appeared in 1963 with the introduction of classical monetary trilemma, or so-called Mundell-Fleming model. Since then, trilemma has become a term of fashion. We know about trade trilemma or globalization trilemma, and we know about financial trilemma. In our opinion, it's a good sign for a realistic approach to the complexity of the situation on the ground. Recently, energy trilemma has emerged as a symbolic term for complexity of countries' governmental objectives. So I'll just read a quote from World Energy Council. Any government seeks to find the optimal answer to 3 requests from the society to the fuel and energy complex. And you can see the understanding of World Energy Council of global energy trilemma. However, our understanding, our definition is a little bit different. Likewise, we highlight economic growth, energy and climate change mitigation, and inequality, including energy poverty, or energy poverty, including inequality. We also try to link global energy trilemma concept, I'll say GET, later on, to sustainable development goals. Those are goals number 8, number 10, and number 7 and 13. The point here is that the global development should address energy, climate, and energy poverty issues, and the latter is connected to inequality through the lifestyle of the middle class and necessity to bring energy into life of the low-income strata in the next decade. Now briefly about energy transition. I'll quickly walk you through the phases, just to remind you that the first energy transition dates back to Industrial Revolution. It happened from wood and water power to coal. The second energy transition happened with the invention of a diesel engine in the beginning of the 20th century. The third energy transition was introduced during the oil crisis of the 1970s. Here the focus is on natural gas, and now we are currently facing the fourth energy transition. It's important to note that structural changes are realized through investments into real assets and technological advances. A transition, as I want to stress it, is a gradual process as far as production and restructuring of the existing technology for a new fuel cannot happen at once. Nowadays, the transition process is accelerated by the ecological standards and norms. Current switch from fossil fuels to renewables is driven primarily by climate change and the necessity to reduce emissions. So where are we now? Our trilemma approach requires us to make our own reassessment of actual processes on the ground in the world economy. At first, we need to involve the factors of demography and inequality, which are relatively rare in energy studies. We decided to take the UN forecast as a relevant background. In addition, we have retained the residual optimism that the long-term growth will be business as usual till 2040. And on this vague background, we had estimated GDP by countries and regions for 2040 by applying the growth rates of the period from 2010 to 2019. So this is not a forecast, this is just an example. However, the results of this simple example for 2040 look pretty disappointing. The rest of the
результаты за до 2014 года весьма разочаровывающие. Касаясь примерно половины населения Земли, эти подсчеты показывают довольно разочарующее ожидание будущего качества. То есть можно признать, что будущий мир будет
The wealthiest countries are growing apart from the world. Middle-income countries are meeting difficulties and struggling for catching up. So global emissions. The global awareness of the climate change problem has come quite recently by historical measures. Our observations add some salt to the optimistic scenarios of the future in energy and climate change mitigation. Not so much has been done in the last decade or two. Many changes came as a byproduct of a technological revolution and two immense economic shocks. Meanwhile, we must underline that the expected decline in 2020 as a result of COVID pandemic and the following recession has come to a point of new growth of greenhouse gas emissions in China, India, and other developing countries as a group. In 2017 and 2019, as you can see from the figure. The choice
показывает 70-е годы.
Strategy for solutions of global energy dilemma will be of crucial importance for the next decades. Among crucial issues, we see the choice between investing in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by production approach and consumption approach. My colleagues have already shed a light on this issue. We have made a simple check up the correlation and try to check up the correlations on the sample of 106 countries and received quite expected results. The surprise for us was the result for 1990, a couple of years before the UN Framework Convention was signed. We expected a high correlation for GDP and production-based emissions per capita across the board, but not that high for the consumption-based case. The correlation was high for both measures in 1990, especially for the developing countries. 27 years of a very substantial growth and implementation of climate policies have brought interesting changes in the correlation. You can see them from the table. The connections demonstrate the importance of the recent economic growth for the emission flows, and it shows the role of consumption-related emissions in both the developed and developing countries. This table gives one more input to the pragmatic and realistic approach to the energy transition, particularly from coal to the next generation regime. As we see now, the coal had retained some capability for preserving its share in global energy balance. International Energy Agency and others they are forecasting that we are currently expecting the share of coal in 2040 to be around 25%. The problem, as we see it, cannot be resolved only by micro steps. That would require long-term planning and financing. The most countries have accepted certain pledges on the progress of renewables reduction of emissions till 2030 by the Paris Agreement. Our key observation in that field is that strong unconditional pledges have been made by a minority of countries, except for China. mostly by the EU members. The problem is that the EU is responsible for just 12% of greenhouse gas emissions, consumption-based, and 10% production-based. Huge financial resources have been spending on that limited platform, while the global emissions kept growing till 2019. With all respect and sympathy for the case, the global emissions cannot be stopped that way. For the general level of global capital financing, as we have shown previously, the picture is not actually bright. After the Great Recession, the capital formation rates were the same or somewhat lower than before, but developed countries reduced their investing intensity. That confirms our suspicion about the inability of the global community to unite around the urgent problems within the global energy trilemma. A more detailed approach to investment process brings more questions. Just a second. Yeah. This figure you see gives a realistic touch on the investments into alternative energy sources. The high expenditures in 2010 and 2011 are easy to explain. High oil prices and slow recovery gave excellent timing and reason for an investment decision to replace the old capacity for modern and efficient ones. Respectively, the oil prices crash had changed the system of profit-based efficiency and led to a decline in investments in the alternative energy sources. That gave us a certain clue to understand the energy investment complex behavior for the next cycle. Between 2015 and 2020, the renewable investment gave very high numbers. However, these investments are probably very far from being sufficient for transition, unfortunately. Much worse, they were stagnant for a few years. Overall results are straightforward. The world would need to redefine an investment approach to energy transition. And the final part devoted to COVID-19 and the recession of 2020. They have currently brought another dimension of the Rodrigues trilemma. If his notice is correct, for the relatively quiet time of upturns in the global business cycle, it must be even more true at the time of severe crisis, fear, and mistrust. Time is passing by, and we're already not on the mitigation stage, but on the adaptation one. The sum of support is not equal to the sum of will and actual capability to act. Nevertheless, even more, for long-term success, the Sustainable Development Goals need good global governance. The attempt of the developed countries to focus on climate is understandable, but may create the conservation of poverty and inequality. The fast-growing population will need food, energy and infrastructure, shelters, development of human capital, and at least somewhat better level of equality. In more practical terms, we would define preconditions for success of the global energy trilemma as following. Probably some reduction of an energy-intensive consumption in developed countries is unavoidable. The lifestyle in developed world can be retained with certain costs. The simultaneous solution of problems of climate change on consumption side. Domestic energy transformation will require substantial investment costs. In major developing countries, the global energy trilemma may be reached within the Sustainable Development Goals. Decent life in developing countries and catching up are starting with eradication of energy poverty. The equation for success of the Sustainable Development Goal as a complex of objectives depends on global energy trilemma with inequality and building infrastructure, institutions, and human capital playing the role of the same importance as climate and energy transition. Our message may be rewritten in a very compact way, and you see that on the slide. Bring back energy and climate problem more closely into the framework of the SDG to make sure we all go to a better and more stable world. So here are some references, and I'll be glad to hear any questions from you.
Thank you, Dzhanneta. Leonid Markovich, would you add anything?
Probably some keep in English. Actually, what we are saying is that most of optimistic scenarios and forecasts are based on technological advances, on certain declared policies, on intentions of China, on plans of Brussels, on Biden changing Trump and respectively joining back the Paris Agreement and so on. So on important moves, incremental changes. As soon as we go to the stock of a problem, stock of emission, stock of investments, or mass investments in general, the picture is very different. I would say the emotional drive and the reality on the ground, they don't match. And we saw it today. We keep explaining each other how good is our policies, how great are politicians changing things. That's fine. That's fine. But we are not in the public debates. We are in the, I would say, laboratory of economic and social analysis. We don't need to be excited about plans of China or Brussels. We need to be rational, stubborn, and completely emotionless. Because we are economists. We are not people in general public good propaganda. I was the person who brought all the green ideas to Russian Ministry of Energy in 2003. And I was 8 years chairman of the board WWF Russia. I was the instrumental in many changes in political circles and media and so on. I supported it for 2 decades. But okay, now we have recession, pandemic, and we have the moment of truth. We need to decide for the next decades in the situation. We don't have global governance. We don't have the systematic plan to change the world. We have a lot of different optimistic changes, but emissions still growing. Emission still growing. European Union, I love these people. We are trying to change, to reduce, it's not 12% on consumption, 10 on emission by production, because it's including United Kingdom. So it's just 8-9% of emission by production. We want to make it zero, fine. What about the rest of the world in the horizon to 2030? What happens in the world at that time? Huge money will be invested in Europe. Finally, maybe they will stop producing lignite in Brandenburg in Poland. And with how it calls, coal or something, Swansea, in Estonia, 57% still on coal in Estonia. So we have some interesting cases in Europe. The problem is, our suggestion is to look again, first on the real situation now. Not changes from before, not intentions, but what is the real picture. Second, and we gave all the tables in correlation which show what is the real picture. Second, we need to assess what are costs of changing. What is, let me put it, how many trillions of dollars necessary to reduce a certain amount of, a certain percentage of emission. China gave the number. We know Chinese cost. They said $15 trillion to 2060 to come to a new in China. They producing 25% of global emission, and we're going to spend, and not quite clear, is it only technological costs or investment, or it includes social costs, probably not social. So we know 1 trillion, European trillion, still we need to find it, this trillion euros, because that number was given in February by Unter the Leyen before the pandemic came. It was before the pandemic with 3 trillion. Now, again, we are fighting the climate change. We are trying to prevent climate change. What is the price? What is the global cost? What are investments necessary to come to producers and consumers of coal in Africa, consumers and producers of coal in India? Do we have any idea what would it be for Colombia? Colombia is exporting, gives about 1/4 of import of Europe. So who is exporting coal to Europe? United States, Russia, and Colombia. About 1/4 each. What would be the cost for Colombia for such changes? So first the idea, let's look into the real picture and look into a long-term run. And second idea is very simple. We are heavily concerned about the climate. We kind of forgetting about poverty. We understand we have, look what is saying the Secretary General of the United Nations for additional 100 million extremely poor people this year. We will need money for healthcare changes. How it changes the financing picture? So the point is, we cannot talk about long-term climate change prevention as a single and kind of only, or not only in verbal text, but practically what are measures to prevent poverty in 2040, because we will have 2 more billion people, mostly in poor countries, additional to current situation. So probably CDG is a good idea.
Actually, you just described the situation which I described as a linkage gap in my presentation. So yes, there is no linkage in the international political regime and in the policies of separate countries. There is no linkage between.
I'm not saying we just invented the whole thing. Wow. we are saying we trying to change even slogans. You are saying about linkage. It's kind of a neutral, polite term. We are saying relema. Sounds dangerous.
Any comments, colleagues?
People died.
Yes, it's probably already too.
There is something about China. Nuclear power stations in China. No, I don't think anybody counting really picture on Chinese situation, because China is doing whatever China wants, and not quite clear who would be accounting that part, because the storage of nuclear waste, as everybody knows, is so costly that any attempt to include cost on waste into the price of electricity from nuclear sector kills the sector. That's obvious situation. That's public cost, and China makes this choice, and that's another dimension of what we were saying now.
Well, okay, so I do not see any more questions or comments. So I think that what we have from all the presentations within this panel. We have very ambitious goals of emission reduction, both for 2030 and 2050. We have understanding that in general, in principle, in theory, this pandemic may be may give the additional impulse to green development worldwide if the recovery would be green, and if some green measures would be implemented worldwide. At the same time, we see that real recovery measures that are implemented worldwide are not quite green, are not very green, at least in most of the countries. But in some of the countries, they are quite green, like in some European countries. In many countries, they are not quite green, and so green recovery worldwide is today more a slogan and recommendation of experts of not the reality, at least now. Probably Biden, if he really implements this huge investment package of $5 trillion, it would be really the great step. And it is real money. It is much more than is planned even in the European Union. Probably the situation will change if it is implemented in US. But in general, in most of the countries, recovery is far from green. It concerns also Russia, because it was well depicted in the presentation of Brian. I suggest that in Russia, the percentage of green measures is 0.0. So again, green recovery is a good recommendation, and in theory it is possible. In reality, it is not implemented so far. As for the long-term climate targets, of course, more and more countries declare them, and some of them understand more or less well how they may achieve this, but they may achieve them nationally, but without understanding the general context. And so, of course, the national measures in countries which amount to like 10% of global emissions, or even less in many countries, it is not sufficient, unfortunately, to solve the problem of climate change. At the same time, we see still the questions about other countries, which I called reluctant countries in my presentation. And I think these questions got no answers in our presentations. So how to reduce emissions in this part of the world, where the emissions are growing, where the capital is expensive, where there is a huge number of poor population, how to reduce emissions in these countries, how to shift them towards the green transition. So I suggest that nobody understands so far. But however, I think that situation today is anyway better than it was 5 years ago, because 5 years ago there were no even declarations on the carbon neutrality. Probably these declarations and some additional plans really get us closer to the victory over climate change. But still, for countries like Russia, the number of questions is still much larger than the number of answers to these questions. How to launch green development in countries like Russia, or not only Russia, but many other countries in the world, not so dependent on fossil fuels probably, but even poorer than Russia. How to launch green transition there, it is still not understood by us as well. So probably it's also the additional impetus for us to work on this even more intensively.
Yeah, my suggestion is to, we have a record of our conference, it's 8th conference. In 2030, naturally, it will be 18th conference, right? And
well, yes.
We need, and academician Ivanova, she will come and say, I remember what you were saying 10 years ago. I keep my notes as well, and so we will require from everybody, from Beijing to Washington, and Brussels, and Moscow, to show the results of climate change prevention by 2030. Otherwise, we will have conference on, let me say, on the hopes and results of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, on this optimistic step, we conclude our discussion today, I think. Tomorrow we will have two more fascinating sessions. The first, which will start at 10:30, will be devoted to the social dimension of coronavirus. We will speak about inequality, we will speak about social policy, we will speak about welfare state in the era of pandemic and probably post-pandemic. And then after the break, we will have another session on US-China decoupling and US-China economic relations after elections in the US, in the conditions of the pandemic, in conditions again after pandemic, what is happening with US-China economic cooperation and economic confrontation. And our conference will be finished by the keynote speech by Branko Milanovic on the global inequality tomorrow in the evening. So I will be happy to see all of you tomorrow if you are able to join us, and so see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
До свидания, до утра.
Thank you. Thank you.